At exactly 9:40 on a Thursday morning, I opened my banking app to check on a wire transfer and found $42,000 missing from an account I had spent 11 years building. Not stolen by a stranger. Not lost to some scam email I clicked on by accident. Taken by my daughter. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before I said anything to anyone. The coffee went cold in front of me. The dog scratched at the back door, and I didn't get up to let him in. I refreshed the screen twice, 3 times. Some small, stubborn part of me convinced the number would correct itself if I just looked at it enough. It didn't. That account wasn't just money. It was 31 years of grading papers until midnight, of skipping vacations, of telling myself someday, every single time I wanted something I didn't buy. It was the promise I made to myself the year my husband died, sitting alone in a hospital hallway, that no matter what happened, I would never become a burden to the daughter I was raising by myself. And that daughter had used it to buy her fiancé's ring. When I finally called her, she didn't apologize. She said, "You weren't using it. My name is Margaret. Everyone calls me Meg, except my mother, who's been gone 11 years now and only ever called me Margaret when she was proud of me," which, looking back, was more often than I gave her credit for at the time. I taught high school English for 31 years. Sophomores, mostly. The kind of kids who roll their eyes at Shakespeare until one day, somewhere around March, one of them raises their hand and says something so sharp about Hamlet's mother that you have to sit down for a second. Those moments were why I stayed as long as I did. Long after the pay stopped making sense, and long after my knees started complaining about the hard classroom floors. I married young, 23, to a man named Walter, who fixed HVAC systems for a living and had the kind of steady, unhurried patience that made me feel like nothing in the world could actually go wrong as long as he was in the room. He used to say that most problems were just systems out of balance, whether it was an air conditioner or a marriage, and you fixed both the same way. You found the blockage and you cleared it calmly, without panic. I believed him for 22 years. We had one daughter, Emily. She came 4 years in the marriage. After 2 losses I don't talk about much, which is maybe part of why, when she finally arrived, I loved her the way you love something you were told you might never get to have. I remember the nurse handing her to me and Walter standing there with his hand over his mouth, not saying a word for almost a full minute. Walter passed when Emily was 17. Heart attack, sudden, no warning, the kind of thing that rearranges your whole understanding of how a Tuesday is supposed to go. I remember standing in the hospital hallway thinking, very clearly, I have to make sure she's okay. Not I need to fall apart because there wasn't room for that yet. There's never room for that when you're the one left standing. So I didn't fall apart. I went back to teaching 3 weeks later because the mortgage didn't care that my husband had died and because staying busy was the only version of grieving I knew how to do. I raised Emily mostly alone for the next several years, on a teacher's salary, in a town where teachers' salaries don't stretch very far. We had a routine. Cereal for dinner on Fridays because it made her laugh. Library trips on Sundays. A budget notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer where I tracked every dollar in pencil because pen felt too permanent for numbers that never stopped moving. And somewhere in there, I started putting money away, not much, some months just $40 or $50, into a retirement account that I told myself every single time I made a deposit was not to be touched. Not for a car repair. Not for a nice vacation. Not for anything except the day I finally got to stop working and just breathe. I remember explaining this to Emily once when she was maybe 22, home for a weekend from college. She'd asked, half joking, why I still drove the same Corolla I'd had since she was in middle school. I told her about the account. I told her it was the one thing in my life that was entirely, unapologetically mine. Not the house, not the car, not even really my time, most days, just that account quietly growing untouched mine. She nodded and said, "That's actually really smart, Mom." I remember feeling proud that she understood. By the time I retired 2 years ago, that account had grown to just over $45,000. It wasn't going to make me rich, but it was going to make sure that if my health held out, I could live the last third of my life without calling my daughter every time the water heater broke. I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters for the rest of this story. Emily was not a difficult child. She wasn't spoiled, not really. She was smart, funny, stubborn in a way that used to remind me painfully of Walter. She got herself through community college and then a 4-year degree in marketing, working nights at a restaurant the whole time, coming home smelling like fryer oil and complaining about tips while she did her homework at my kitchen counter. I am proud of her. 2 years ago, she met Chase. Chase worked in commercial insurance, drove a car that was nicer than his salary probably justified, and had a way of talking about the future that made everything sound inevitable. The house, the wedding, the second home upstate, eventually. He was polite to me, called me Ms. Margaret, which I found a little formal but sweet. He seemed to genuinely care about Emily, and more than once I watched him notice when she got quiet and ask her what was wrong before she'd even said anything was. At Thanksgiving that first year, he offered to do the dishes without being asked, which, for what it's worth, is the single fastest way to earn favor with a widow who's done every holiday's dishes alone for 13 years. I liked him. I want that on the record too, because what happened later isn't really his fault, not in the way you might expect. I should also tell you about Carol, because she becomes part of this story later, and I don't want her to appear out of nowhere. Carol taught social studies 2 doors down from my classroom for almost 20 years. We ate lunch together most days, graded papers together some Fridays, and after Walter died, she was the one who showed up at my house with a casserole and just sat with me in silence for 2 hours, not saying a single word about grief or God, or everything happens for a reason, which is exactly what I needed at the time and didn't know how to ask for. Carol knew about the retirement account. She knew about the land Walter's uncle left behind, though not the full extent of what it eventually became. She was, in a lot of ways, the only person who understood exactly how much that $45,000 represented, not just as a number, but as 31 years of a very particular kind of discipline. I mention her because in this story, more than once, Carol says things out loud that I was too close to the situation to say to myself. About 8 months ago, Emily started talking about engagement rings the way some people talk about the weather, constantly, casually, weaving it into every conversation. She'd send me photos. Look at this one, Mom. Isn't it stunning? 3 carats. 4 rings that cost more than Walter and I paid for our first car, back when a car was still something you could buy with a summer's worth of savings. I didn't think much of it. Young women get excited about rings. I remember being that age myself, though the rings I dreamed about back then cost considerably less, and the one Walter eventually gave me, a thin gold band with a modest little stone, I wore every day for 22 years and never once wished it were bigger. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that Chase had already picked out a ring. A modest one, beautiful, tasteful, well within what a 29-year-old in commercial insurance could reasonably afford. He'd shown Emily a picture of it, actually thinking he was including her in the surprise, the way you'd think that would be a kindness rather than a mistake. She hated it. Not out loud, not to him, but she came to me one Sunday afternoon, sat down across from me at this same kitchen table, and said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to not judge me." That's the part that still sits strangely with me, months later. In that moment, sitting across from my daughter, I genuinely believed she wasn't asking me for money. I told her the ring didn't matter, that Chase loved her, that in 5 years she wouldn't remember the carat weight, but she'd remember how he looked at her on their wedding day, how his hands shook a little when he said his vows. She nodded along, said I was right, hugged me before she left, and told me not to worry, she'd figure something out. I didn't think about the conversation again for almost 3 weeks. I want to mention something small that I've thought about a great deal since. About 10 days after that conversation, my friend Carol, we've known each other since we were both student teachers, 30-some years now, mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd seen Emily at the jewelry counter at the mall, looking very serious about something in the case. I remember laughing it off. I said, "She's just dreaming, Carol. Every bride-to-be does that." Carol shrugged and said something like, "She didn't look like she was dreaming. She looked like she was deciding." I didn't think anything more of it. I wish I had. Here's something I should explain, because it becomes important. Back when Walter died, I added Emily as a joint signer on one of my accounts. Not the retirement fund itself, but a linked checking account I used mostly for bill pay. I did it because I was 17 years into raising a teenager alone. My health wasn't perfect, and I wanted someone to be able to access money quickly if something happened to me. It was a safety net, not an invitation. Over the years, as the accounts got restructured and rolled over through two different retirement products, that joint access somehow, through a clerical oversight neither of us caught, and I've since confirmed this with the bank in writing, never got properly removed. Emily still had signing authority on an account that had, without either of us really tracking it, become linked to my retirement fund. I hadn't checked that account in months. Why would I? It was my safety net, not a checking account I use day to day. On a Thursday morning, the same one I told you about at the start, I logged in to move some year-end funds around for taxes and found $42,000 gone, wired out 3 weeks earlier to a jeweler in the city. 2 days after Emily sat at my table and told me she wasn't asking me for anything. 2 days after Carol saw her standing over a jewelry case, deciding. I called the bank first because my first instinct, I'll admit this, was that someone had hacked the account. A fraud department representative walked me through the transaction patiently, the way you'd talk to someone you could tell was about to have a very bad morning. Verified login. Verified device. The transfer had been authorized from a phone registered to Emily's name, using credentials that had been on that account, technically, legally, for 11 years. It wasn't fraud, not according to the bank, not according to the law, but it was theft in every way that matters between a mother and a daughter. I called Emily. My hands were not steady. I remember that specifically. I had to set my phone down on the table and put it on speaker because I couldn't hold it still. Emily, I said, I need you to explain something to me. There's $42,000 missing from my retirement account, wired to a jewelry store 3 weeks ago. Do you know anything about that? There was a pause. Not a shocked pause. A calculating one. I've spent 31 years watching teenagers decide, in real time, whether to lie to me. I know what that silence sounds like. Okay, she finally said. Okay, Mom, before you freak out. I'm not freaking out, I said, though my voice was already shaking. I would like an explanation. I was going to tell you. I was going to pay it back. I swear, once Chase and I... Emily, I bought the ring, she said. The one I told you about. The one I actually wanted. I sat very still. You used my retirement account. Without asking me. I didn't think you'd say yes if I asked, she said. And I want you to notice that. Now I'm sorry. Now I panicked. An admission, almost proud of its own honesty, that she had bypassed my consent because she predicted, correctly, that I would have refused. So you took it instead. It's not like you were using it, Emily said. You have your pension. You have Social Security. That account is just sitting there. Mom, you never even touch it. I remember the exact chill that went through me at those words. You weren't using it. As though a retirement fund only counts as real, only counts as mine, if I'm actively withdrawing from it in front of witnesses. Emily, that account exists so that if I get sick, if the roof caves in, if I live to be 90, I don't become a burden to you, I said. It exists so I never have to call you and ask for help, the way some of my friends have had to call their children. I built that so you would never have to make the decision you just made for yourself without asking me. I'll pay it back, she said again. After the wedding. Chase's parents are giving us money. I can pay you back in installments. It's not gone forever, Mom. It's just borrowed. You didn't borrow it, I said. Borrowing requires the other person to know. She got quiet, and then, this is the part one still think about most, she got defensive. You're being really dramatic about this. It's a family loan. People do this all the time. I'm your daughter. I'm literally going to inherit that money someday anyway. I hung up the phone. I didn't hang up out of rage, exactly, though there was plenty of that underneath. I hung up because I suddenly understood something with total clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes maybe 3 or 4 times in a person's life. My daughter did not see that money as mine. She saw it as pre-inheritance, a resource that belonged to the family in the abstract, currently being stored under my name, available to be redirected whenever she judged the need urgent enough. Over the following 2 weeks, Emily called 4 times. Each call followed roughly the same pattern. An opening apology, so brief it barely qualified, followed by a longer explanation of why the ring mattered so much, followed by an accusation, gently phrased, that I was overreacting, being cold, punishing her for something that would work itself out. There was one call, the second one, where she tried a different approach entirely. Not pleading, but reasoning the way she used to argue for a later curfew when she was 15, building her case point by point like she'd rehearsed it in the shower. "Mom, think about it logically," she said. "If I hadn't used the account, you would have eventually given me money for the wedding anyway, right? Parents do that. So really, I just moved the timeline up. It's not like the money left the family. It's not like I bought a car with it or gambled it away. I bought a ring for my wedding. To you. Emily, there's a difference between a gift and a withdrawal," I said. "A gift is something I choose to give. What you did was decide on my behalf what I was willing to give and then take it before I had the chance to disagree. You're twisting it to make me sound like a criminal." "I'm not twisting anything," I said. "I'm describing exactly what happened." She hung up on me that time, not the other way around, and I sat with the dial tone for a long moment before I put the phone down. It was the first time in the entire ordeal that I felt something shift from hurt into resolve, the specific, quiet resolve of a woman who has just realized that being reasonable with someone unwilling to be reasonable back accomplishes nothing. On the third call, she cried, and I'll be honest, almost worked. There is nothing quite like the particular ache of hearing your own child cry and knowing that some old, wired-in part of you wants to fix it immediately, no matter what caused it. I had to physically leave the room, walk out to the backyard, and stand in the cold for a few minutes before I trusted myself to speak again. Chase called me once too, and this call was different. He sounded confused, almost hurt, in a way that told me he hadn't fully understood the situation either. "Ms. Margaret," he said, "Emily told me her mom helped out with the ring upgrade." I didn't realize. I thought that was like a gift you offered. "She didn't say you didn't know." I told him the truth. All of it. I heard him go quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. "That's not what she told me," he finally said. There was a heaviness in his voice that told me this wasn't the first small inconsistency he'd noticed in Emily's version of events. Just the first one large enough that he felt he had to say something out loud. I didn't ask him to do anything with that information. I wasn't trying to sabotage the engagement, whatever Emily might believe to this day. I just couldn't keep carrying a lie that wasn't mine to carry. I told Carol everything over coffee about a week after it happened. I remember she set her cup down very deliberately, the way she used to when a student gave an answer, so long she needed a full second to decide how to respond. "Meg," she said, "I need you to hear something, and I need you to not get defensive when I say it. This isn't really about the ring." "I know it's not about the ring," I said. "It's about the money." "It's not about the money either." Carol shook her head slowly. "It's about whether Emily believes you're a person or whether you're just infrastructure. Something that's supposed to be there, holding the family up, and doesn't get asked what it needs." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't fully, months later, except that the question itself changed something in me. I'd spent 31 years being infrastructure for a classroom of teenagers who needed someone steady, and 17 years being infrastructure for a daughter who needed the same thing after her father died. I had never once stopped to ask myself when infrastructure gets to also be a person with her own needs. Carol's question sat with me for days. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. "I don't know yet," I told her. "But I know I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen." 3 weeks after the missing money, I met with an estate attorney named Diane Castellano, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I'd been referred to by a former colleague. I hadn't updated my will since Walter died. 13 years of neglect, if I'm honest, the kind of thing you always mean to get to and never quite do until something forces your hand. Something had just forced my hand. Here is the thing Emily did not know. The thing almost no one in my life knew, aside from my accountant and now my estate attorney. The retirement account Emily emptied. The $42,000 was real money, and losing it hurt in every practical sense. But it was not, and had never been, the whole picture. 11 years ago, not long after Walter passed, I inherited something I never told Emily about. A small piece of undeveloped land Walter's late uncle had left him, out near the county line, that Walter himself hadn't known was worth much of anything. It sat in a file cabinet for years, a deed nobody thought about, weeds growing over a piece of dirt that seemed to matter to no one. I sat on it, assuming it was worthless swampland, until a development company came knocking 6 years ago wanting to build a distribution facility nearby. I sold it, quietly, for considerably more than I'd ever expected. Enough that, combined with careful investing over the following years and the help of a financial advisor I trust completely, I had built a second, separate portfolio that Emily had no idea existed. I never told her. Partly out of habit, Walter and I never discussed money loosely around Emily, even as an adult, because we'd both grown up in households where money talk bred either shame or entitlement, and we didn't want either for her. Partly out of a kind of superstition, if I'm honest, an old fear left over from my own upbringing that money talked about out loud has a way of disappearing. And partly, I'll admit now, because some quiet instinct in me, the same instinct that made me keep that retirement account separate and untouched for 11 years, told me it was wiser to let Emily believe her mother lived modestly on a pension and small savings, rather than know there was a cushion she might someday come looking for. I want to be clear about something. I was never planning to hide this from her forever. My original plan, before any of this happened, was for that second portfolio to be split evenly, a substantial gift to Emily and her future family, and a portion set aside in a scholarship fund at the high school where I taught, in Walter's name, something to keep a small piece of him standing long after both of us were gone. I had actually met with my advisor about accelerating that gift, thinking I might help with a down payment on a house once Emily and Chase were married and settled. I remember sitting in that advisor's office, imagining Emily's face when I told her, imagining handing her something that would change the whole shape of her life. The $42,000 she stole didn't bankrupt me. That's not the twist. The twist is what it revealed. Sitting across from my attorney, I laid out everything. The joint account oversight, the wire transfer, Emily's words on the phone. You weren't using it, and Diane Castellano looked at me for a long moment and asked a question I hadn't let myself fully ask myself yet. Margaret, she said, if she did this while you were alive, sitting right in front of her, what do you think happens to the rest of it once you're not here to say no? I didn't answer right away. I sat in that office chair and thought about every version of Emily I'd ever known. The toddler who used to hide vegetables in her sock, the teenager who cried over a B+, the young woman who worked double shifts to pay her own way through college, and I tried to reconcile all of them with the woman on the phone who'd told me, without flinching, that she was literally going to inherit that money anyway. I didn't need Diane to answer her own question. We both already knew. I restructured my will that week, not out of spite. I want to be honest about my own heart here, because this story isn't really about revenge, even though I know that's the flavor people expect from stories like this one. I restructured it because I finally understood, with total clarity, that money handed to Emily without boundaries wasn't going to become security for her. It was going to become a habit, a belief that whatever her mother had was hers for the taking, the moment the need felt urgent enough to justify it. The bulk of the second portfolio, the part Emily never knew existed, went into an irrevocable trust, structured, with Diane's help, so that Emily could not access the principal directly, ever, under any circumstance, no matter what she asked or how she asked it. Instead, it would fund two things: the scholarship of my old high school, permanently in Walter's name, and a separate protected account for any grandchildren Emily might someday have, accessible only when they turned 25, with terms that made it functionally impossible for anyone, including Emily, to touch it early. I left Emily something too. I want to be clear about that, because I never stopped loving her, not for one single day of this. I left her the house, paid off, worth a fair amount, a real and meaningful gift. But the liquid money, the portfolio she didn't know about, the safety net she assumed would eventually flow to her simply because she was my daughter, that was gone from her reach entirely, replaced by something she couldn't touch, and, for a long while, didn't even know existed. Before I signed the final paperwork, I sat with it for almost a week because I wanted to be certain I wasn't acting purely out of hurt. I called my financial advisor, a calm, unhurried man named Robert who had managed the second portfolio since the land sale, and I asked him directly, am I doing this because I'm angry, or Because it's right? He didn't answer right away, either. Everyone in this story, it seems, needed a moment before they could answer that question honestly. Finally, he said, "Margaret, I've watched you build this slowly and quietly for 6 years. You never once talked about spending it on yourself. Every plan you ever described to me involved giving it away. To Emily, to the school, to grandchildren who don't exist yet. The only thing that's changed is you're finally asking whether the person you were planning to give it to has earned the responsibility that comes with it. That's not anger. That's just finally paying attention." That conversation settled something in me. I signed the paperwork 3 days later in Diane's office, with Carol sitting beside me in the waiting room, because I'd asked her to come, because I didn't want to do it alone. I didn't tell Emily any of this. Not yet. I let 3 more months pass. Emily and Chase's wedding happened as planned. I attended. I smiled in the photographs. I hugged her at the altar and told her I loved her, because I did, because loving someone and being furious at them are not mutually exclusive states, whatever the greeting cards would have you believe. Chase's ring, the $18,000 upgrade, funded by my retirement, sat on her finger the entire day, catching the light every time she raised a glass. And I said nothing about it because I had already said everything I needed to say on that Thursday morning phone call. I danced with her father's memory more than I danced with anyone in the room that night. If I'm honest, there's a particular loneliness to celebrating your only child's wedding as a widow, standing where 2 people should be standing. The reveal came 4 months after the wedding, when Emily and Chase came to me asking for help with a down payment on a house. They sat at the same kitchen table where Emily had first told me about the ring. Chase did most of the talking. The market was competitive. The house they wanted needed a 12% down payment. They were $40,000 short, and Emily had told him, he said carefully, that my mom sometimes helps out with big stuff. I looked at my daughter. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Emily," I said, "do you remember what you told me the day I found out about the ring?" She shifted in her seat. "Mom, please, can we not do this right now? You said the retirement account was just sitting there, that I wasn't using it, that you were essentially entitled to borrow against money that would someday be yours anyway." Chase glanced between us, visibly uncomfortable, clearly hearing new details of story he thought he already knew. "I want to tell you both something," I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I used to when I had to discipline a classroom of 16-year-old without ever raising my voice, because raised voices lose rooms and calm voices hold them. There was more money than the retirement account, money neither of you knew about, and I had originally planned, before any of this happened, to use a good portion of it to help exactly the kind of thing you're asking me for right now. A house, a future, a real gift given freely because I want to give it. Emily's face changed. Something like hope flickered there. "That money's gone now," I continued. "Not spent, not lost, restructured into a trust that neither of us can touch, that will fund a scholarship in your father's name for as long as that school exists, and that will be there for your children, Emily, when they're 25 years old and have shown they understand what it means to be trusted with something valuable." The silence in that kitchen was the loudest silence I have ever sat inside. "You're punishing me," Emily finally said, her voice cracking. "Because of the ring. This whole time, you've been punishing me." "No," I said. "I'm protecting the version of myself who spent 31 years teaching other people's children so I could someday retire without fear. And I'm protecting the version of you who deserves parents who taught her that trust, once broken, doesn't just repair itself because enough time passes." Chase spoke up then quietly. "Emily didn't tell me the truth about the ring for a long time. I want you to know I understand why you did this." Emily left that day angry. She didn't speak to me for almost 6 weeks, which was its own kind of grief, a fresh one, layered right on top of the old one, the way grief tends to do. There were nights during those 6 weeks I sat in the same kitchen, at the same table, and wondered if I had traded a daughter for a principal. I want to be honest that I doubted myself. More than once. I remember one Tuesday in particular, about 3 weeks into the silence, when I drove past the bridal shop where Emily had gotten her dress fitted and had to pull over for a few minutes because my chest felt tight in a way I didn't have a name for. It wasn't regret exactly. It was closer to mourning. Mourning the version of this story where none of it had happened, where Emily had simply asked me for help with the ring, and I had simply said yes, and we'd gone shopping together like I always imagined we might, the two of us picking something out with Walter's memory somewhere in the room. That version never existed, but I grieved it anyway, the way you sometimes grieve things that were never real to begin with, just because you'd quietly hoped for them. I called Carol during that stretch, more than once too. She'd come over some evenings and just sit with me, the same way she had after Walter died, and one night, she said something I've held on to since. "Meg, you didn't take anything away from her that was ever hers to begin with. You just stopped letting her believe it was." Those are two very different things, even if they feel identical from where you're sitting right now. I keep waiting for it to feel like the right decision, I told Carol that night. Instead, it just feels like a decision. Correct, maybe, but not comforting. Some of the most important things we ever do don't feel comforting for a long time, Carol said. Sometimes not ever. That doesn't make them wrong. I also spoke to Robert again during that period, mostly because I needed reassurance that I hadn't made an irreversible mistake out of wounded pride. He pulled up the trust documents and walked me through them line by line. The scholarship allocation, the grandchildren's account, the modest but real gift of a paid-off house still sitting there for Emily. "This isn't punitive, Margaret," he said. "A punitive structure would have cut her out completely. What you built still includes her. It just doesn't hand her unlimited access to something she's already shown she'll misuse without asking." That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. I wasn't trying to erase my daughter from my life's work. I was trying to make sure that whatever she eventually received, she received it having understood exactly what it cost to build. I found out much later from Chase what those 6 weeks actually looked like on Emily's side of things. He told me she barely mentioned it at first, went quiet whenever his own mother asked how the house search was going, snapped at him twice over things that had nothing to do with any of this, cried once in the car outside a furniture store for reasons she wouldn't explain until he pulled the car over and just waited her out. He said the turning point wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single conversation or a single realization. It was smaller than that. An evening, about a month in, when Emily was helping her friend Jessica pack up an apartment before a move, and Jessica mentioned offhand that her own mother had quietly co-signed a small loan for her without telling her husband, just to help her out, and never once brought it up again or expected anything back. Emily apparently went very quiet in the car afterward. Chase asked what was wrong. She said, "I don't think I've ever done anything like that for anyone. I don't think I've ever even thought to. I don't know if that's exactly true of my daughter. I suspect it isn't, not entirely, because I've watched her be generous in smaller ways her whole life. But I understood what she meant. There's a difference between generosity you extend when it's convenient, and generosity you extend when it costs you something and nobody's watching." She was starting to understand that difference too, in her own time, in her own way. But something shifted in that silence. I know now, because she told me later that Chase pushed her to actually reckon with what she'd done. Not the theft itself, which she'd already minimized a dozen different ways, but the sentence. "You weren't using it." He asked her, she told me, how she'd feel if he ever said that about something of hers, her car, her savings, her time. She called me on a Sunday afternoon, almost 2 months after that conversation in my kitchen. She didn't ask for anything. She said, "I've been thinking about what I said to you. About the account. I think I convinced myself it was okay because I wanted it to be okay, and I never really asked whether it actually was. It wasn't a full repair. Repairs like this don't happen in a single phone call, and I didn't pretend it did. But it was a beginning, an honest one, the first honest thing she'd said to me since that Thursday morning almost a year earlier. We're rebuilding, slowly. She's paying me back for the $42,000 in real installments, tracked in writing, on terms we both agreed to and both respect. The first payment came with a note, a real handwritten one, that just said, "I'm sorry it took me this long to say it and mean it." I kept that note. It's in the same drawer where I used to keep my old budget notebook, the one with the pencil marks tracking every dollar I ever put toward the account she eventually emptied. She still wears the ring. I've never once asked her to feel guilty about that, because a ring given in love doesn't stop being loved just because the money behind it was taken rather than given. Chase and I have grown closer, oddly enough, through all of this. He calls sometimes just to check on me, And I think some of that comes from having watched up close what it looks like when someone finally tells the truth after a long time of not. We've settled into a new rhythm since then, Emily and I. She calls on Sundays now, a habit that started almost by accident and has held for months. Sometimes we talk about nothing, a recipe she's trying, a work frustration, whether I've finally replaced the Corolla, which I haven't, and probably won't. Sometimes the conversation drifts somewhere closer to what happened. Carefully, the way you test a floorboard you're not sure will hold your weight. She asked me once, a few months ago, whether I'd ever fully trust her with money again. I told her the truth, that trust isn't something I was withholding as punishment. It was something that gets rebuilt the same way it gets broken, one honest choice at a time, and that she was already, slowly, doing the work of rebuilding it. Last month, Emily asked if she could bring me to visit the school where I used to teach, to see the plaque they'd put up for the scholarship fund. The one in Walter's name, the one funded by money she still doesn't fully understand the origin of, though I've told her more than she once knew. It was a small ceremony, really just a handful of faculty, the current principal and 2 students who'd been chosen as the fund's first recipients, a shy junior who wanted to study nursing, and a senior boy who reminded me so much of the students I used to teach that I had to look away for a moment to collect myself. Emily stood in front of that plaque for a long time, reading her father's name engraved beneath the school's crest, and when she turned around, her eyes were wet. "I used to think you were just careful with money," she said. "I didn't understand you were protecting something. I thought it was about control." "It was never about control," I told her. "It was about making sure no one, not even someone I love more than my own life, could take away the one thing I built entirely by myself." "Dad would have loved this," she said, looking back at the plaque. "He always said you were a practical." I don't think either of us understood what all that practicality was actually for. "It was for exactly this," I said, "even if it took a hard year to get here." She nodded, and for the first time in over a year, I felt like my daughter actually heard me. Not just the words, but the years underneath them, the ones she hadn't been there for, the ones before she was even born, when a young widow-to-be was quietly, stubbornly, deciding that no matter what life did to her, she would never again be a person whose needs came last in her own story. We drove home, mostly in comfortable silence that afternoon, the kind we hadn't shared in a long time, and somewhere on the highway, without any particular lead-up, she said, "I want to be the kind of mother who asks first. When it's my turn." I didn't say much back. I just reached over and put my hand on hers for a moment, the way I used to when she was small and riding in the passenger seat of a car her father was driving, back when the 3 of us were still whole. The trust remains exactly as I structured it. I haven't reversed a single decision, and I don't plan to, not because I'm still angry, but because I finally understand that love and boundaries were never supposed to be opposites. I spent so many years believing that being a good mother meant being endlessly available, endlessly giving, endlessly used, if that's what love required. It doesn't. I learned that at 63 years old, sitting alone at a kitchen table on a Thursday morning, staring at a number that had disappeared. I think about that phone call often. You weren't using it. And I've come to believe it wasn't really about the money at all. It was about whether I still counted as a person with needs of my own, or whether, somewhere along the way, I'd quietly become just a resource to be managed by the people I loved. I chose to remind everyone, gently but permanently, that I did. It took losing $42,000 for me to finally understand a lesson I should have learned decades earlier. That being needed and being respected are not the same thing, and a family that only offers you the first one isn't actually finished loving you. It's just unfinished learning how. If you're a parent who's ever had someone in your life decide your boundaries were optional simply because you love them, I hope this reminded you that protecting yourself isn't the opposite of loving your family. Sometimes it's the only way to teach them how. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, consider subscribing. There are more still to tell.